Regenerative farming is all about building healthier soil. But does healthier soil make our food more nutritious? And by extension, does it make us healthier? Well, the answer turns out to be a bit more complicated than you might think. Hello, I'm Monica Reinagel, and this is the Nutrition Diva podcast, a show where we take a closer look at nutrition news, research, and trends so that you can make more informed decisions about what you eat. I recently had a fantastic opportunity to attend a conference on regenerative agriculture. It was hosted by the Soil Health Academy. This is a nonprofit organization that educates and helps farmers and ranchers in adopting regenerative practices. And the conference was held on Kinloch Farms, a family-owned farm in the beautiful rolling hills of Northern Virginia, not far from Washington, D.C. Kinloch is committed to conserving and restoring the land, the water, the native habitat, while at the same time running a cattle operation that is humane and environmentally responsible and profitable. No small challenge, but one that they are meeting quite admirably. I have never known a farm to have a full-time conservationist on staff. Needless to say, I came away inspired. I've already started experimenting with some of these practices in my own itty-bitty city vegetable plot. And I've also identified some regenerative farmers in my area so that I can support this movement with my grocery dollars as well. Shout out to Hidden Waters Farm in Pikesville, Maryland. Because if we believe in the value of this approach, then we need to make regenerative agriculture financially feasible for the farmers who are trying to better steward the environment in this way. One of the themes that was woven throughout this conference was the importance of context. Because regenerative agriculture isn't about following a rigid set of rules, it's about applying a set of practices thoughtfully in the context of each unique farm and ecosystem. Ray Archuleta, one of the patron saints of this movement, expresses it this way: information is essential, but knowledge is information in context, which allows us to connect all the dots accurately and effectively in any given situation. So with all of this emphasis on context, it was a bit ironic that when it came time to talking about the impacts of regenerative farming on the nutrient composition of foods or on human health, I felt that the information being shared was sometimes missing important context. And I am not trying to point fingers here. The people promoting regenerative agriculture are swimming upstream against powerful economic and cultural currents. They are trying to make the strongest case they can for a movement that I also want to see succeed. My concern is just that people may end up repeating information that is somewhat distorted or misleading, and that relying on talking points that are easy to refute or dismiss might ultimately undermine this cause. So today I want to look at a few key questions about the impact of different types of farming practices on the nutrient quality of the food that's produced, and I want to add just a bit more context. Again, my goal is not to weaken the case for regenerative farming, but to make it even stronger. One of the data points that you may have come across before is that the fruits and vegetables in our supermarkets today are dramatically less nutritious than they were several decades ago. And there is some truth to this. Analyses of food composition tables from the 50s through the 90s do show declines in certain nutrients. For example, calcium, iron, and phosphorus appear to have dropped by about 10 to 20% in some garden crops. Riboflavin, one of the B vitamins, was down by nearly 40%, and protein content has also dipped slightly. But some nutrients actually increased in certain foods over that same period, so we need to be careful not to oversimplify this story. And in fact, it seems likely that these changes in nutrient density have been driven primarily by changes in the varieties that we grow these days, and not by soil depletion. When breeders select for higher yields, bigger ears of corn, faster growing wheat, larger heads of broccoli, the concentration of minerals and protein tends to go down a little bit. This has been referred to as the dilution effect. And breeders aren't always prioritizing yield. Sometimes it's about pursuing flavor profiles that consumers will like. They're selecting for sweeter fruit or less bitter vegetables. But the very compounds that make a vegetable bitter often also provide some of the health benefits. So when we are selecting for flavor, we may sometimes be sacrificing some of the nutritional value. But I would argue that low nutrient intakes in our population have less to do with the fact that our produce is lower in nutrients and far more to do with the fact that we just eat too few fruits and vegetables. And finally, some of the more dramatic data points are a lot less incriminating once you have more context. For example, one frequently cited study found a 76% decrease in copper levels in some vegetables between the 1940s and the 1990s, and many interpreted that as evidence of soil depletion. But in reality, most of that decline is explained by the fact that farmers used to apply copper-based pesticides much more widely than they do today. When those fell out of favor, copper levels in crops naturally dropped. That's not really about declining soil fertility. That's just about farm practices changing. So yes, nutrient concentrations have shifted over time, but the story is far more nuanced than just our soils are depleted and therefore our food is empty. The next question that I want to examine is how various growing practices impact the nutrient density of the produce that's being grown today. Because this is another area where the information is not always provided with enough context to transform it into useful knowledge. But first, let's define a couple of terms. Conventional farming, which represents the vast majority of food production in the United States, often relies on large-scale monocultures, growing a single crop over a vast number of acres. The fields are typically tilled to prepare the soil, and fertility is maintained primarily with synthetic fertilizers, which supply nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, but don't do much to build organic matter. Pesticides and herbicides are used routinely to control pests and weeds. And in livestock systems, animals are often raised in concentrating operations, with feed brought in from elsewhere, and the manure that they produce disposed of as a waste product. This approach, whether for crops or for animals, can be very efficient in terms of yield, but it can also lead to soil erosion, loss of biodiversity, contamination of waterways, and reduced resilience to pests, drought, and other weather extremes. Now, organic farming represents an important step forward. By restricting synthetic fertilizers and pesticides, it does reduce some of the environmental and the chemical burdens of conventional farming. And organic standards also restrict the use of antibiotics and growth-promoting hormones in livestock. But organic regulations aren't as focused on how the soil is managed. For instance, organic farmers often rely on frequent tilling to control weeds because herbicides are off the table. And ironically, tilling can damage the soil structure and the microbial life. These are unintended consequences that may not have been fully understood until more recently. And livestock may still be raised separately from crops, which means that the potential synergies between these two aren't always realized. So regenerative agriculture takes things a big step further. Instead of focusing on what chemicals you can or cannot use, regenerative practices prioritize minimizing soil disturbance and maintaining living roots in the ground year-round, encouraging biodiversity, and integrating livestock. And the aim is to restore soil health and fertility and improve water retention, sequester carbon, and support long-term ecological balance. Now, just to give you an idea of the relative scale here, Organic accounts for about 6% of all food sales in the United States. And we have a federally regulated certification program which really enhances the visibility and the consumer awareness of organic products. Regenerative agriculture, by contrast, is still a whole lot smaller, and it also lacks a widely adopted certification, and that sometimes makes it harder to recognize these products in the marketplace. And in the show notes, I have included some resources to help you find regenerative growers near you. So if conventional agriculture is Goliath and organic is little Davy, well then regenerative is more like a tiny ant crawling next to Davy's shoe. Very small by comparison, but hopefully poised to play a much bigger role in the future. So now that we've defined our terms, let's take a look at how organic and regenerative farming affect the nutritional quality of the food that they produce. Because it is commonly believed that food grown using these more integrated and holistic practices is more nutritious. And intuitively, it seems obvious that this would be true. But the truth is more complex. Big systematic reviews have generally found that organic produce isn't consistently higher in nutrients than conventional. Some studies do show more antioxidants in organic crops. Others report slightly higher phosphorus or differences in acidity, but the results are inconsistent and the differences are often quite modest. And it's also really hard to control for all of the other factors that play a role in nutrient density, such as the specific variety or cultivar that's been grown, where it was grown, the weather that particular season, how ripe the produce was at harvest, and how long it's been stored before they did those measurements, and so on. Each of these factors may actually have a bigger impact on those measured nutrient levels than whether it was organic or not. Now, there's a lot less research to go on for regenerative farming, but a couple of small, well-designed studies have found that crops from regenerative farms have higher levels of certain vitamins, minerals, and phytochemicals compared with produce from nearby conventional farms. And healthier soil may make soil-based nutrients more available to the plants, and this would translate into more nutritious crops. But even when these nutrient differences are documented, this may not always translate into a meaningful impact on human health. Now, let me give you an example. Grass-fed or regeneratively raised beef can have up to 10 times more calcium than conventional beef. But a serving still only provides about 2% of your daily calcium needs. And similarly, regeneratively produced milk, meat, and eggs appear to be higher in many phytonutrients than their conventional counterparts. And this is presumably because the animals are exposed to a wider range of more nutritious forage plants. And by the way, eating a wider range of nutritious plants will increase the phytonutrient content of your muscles too. But even if the phytonutrient levels are higher than in conventional, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are high. If you're interested in increasing your phytonutrient intake, eating more plants is going to get you there a lot quicker than eating beef from cows who ate more plants. Now, if on the other hand you're looking for high-quality protein or iron or vitamin B12, then beef is going to be a lot more efficient than plants. We should also talk about how having access to pasture impacts the fat profile of beef, as this is also a frequently repeated talking point. Grass-finished beef is almost 3 times higher in omega-3 fatty acids than conventional beef. That is a true fact. But here's the context that is often missing. You'd get more omega-3 from a single walnut than you would from a 6-ounce grass-fed steak, and that is technically 2 servings of beef. So the takeaway here is this: both organic and regenerative systems can absolutely shift the nutrient profile of foods. In particular, it seems clear that livestock raised in regenerative operations are eating a higher quality and a more nutrient-dense diet. But the impact of this on our total nutrient intake is probably still modest. Finally, I've noticed that people are often convinced that eating organic or regeneratively farmed foods will reduce the risk of various diseases, either because they're more nutritious or because they may be lower in pesticides and other chemical residues. And this is another place where I want to add a bit more context, even though it may not be what you want to hear. Several large studies have found that eating organic does not significantly reduce the incidence of disease. In other words, eating more produce and other nutritious whole foods appears to reduce disease risk regardless of how it is produced. So does all of this mean that regenerative agriculture is a waste of time and effort? Or that buying regeneratively produced foods is a waste of money? Not at all. In my opinion, the real promise of regenerative farming lies not just in what ends up on our plate, but what's happening beneath our feet. Studies comparing regenerative and conventional farms have found that regenerative systems can triple scores on various soil health tests within just a few years. And that living soil is better at cycling nutrients and retaining water. That saves farmers money and labor, and it makes our air and water a lot cleaner. And crops and livestock grown in a balanced ecosystem are also more resistant to drought, disease, and pests, which ultimately shores up the security of our food system. So to me, there's little question that regenerative practices are a big win for the environment, wildlife, animal welfare, farmers, communities, and ultimately for us as eaters. Now, we haven't really talked about taste, which, after all, is somewhat subjective. But many people find that the flavor of fresh eggs, milk, meat, and vegetables from your local regenerative farmer cannot be beat. And there's an awful lot to be said for having an opportunity to personally thank the people who are growing your food. So if you'd like to get involved, the Soil Health Academy and Regenerative Farmers of America offer tons of resources for farmers and growers interested in learning more or getting started. And one of the things I really appreciate about the regenerative movement is that it's not a binary equation where you're either in the club or you're not. You are encouraged to simply start where you are and identify what might be possible in your context. And the idea is that no matter where you are starting from or how far you ultimately end up traveling, every step along this path is a step worth taking. If you're a consumer, there is an interactive regenerative farm map that can help you find producers near you, and you'll find links to all of these resources along with links to some related Nutrition Diva episodes in the show notes for today. And if you're a backyard or an urban gardener like me, look for books on regenerative gardening and landscaping at your local library or bookstore. There is plenty that you can do on your own plot. If you have a question or a topic you'd like me to tackle on the podcast, you can email it to me at nutrition@quickanddirtytips.com. And if you'd like to find out about having me speak at your next in-person or virtual event, you can learn more at wellnessworkshere.com. Nutrition Diva is a Quick and Dirty Tips podcast. Holly Hutchings is our director of podcasts. Steve Riekeberg is the audio engineer. Morgan Christensen heads up podcast operations and advertising. Rebecca Sebastian is our manager of marketing and publicity. And Nat Hoops is our marketing and operations assistant. Thanks to all of them, and thanks to you for listening.